Welcome to this webinar series entitled Navigating New Waters, Calming the Rough Seas. Today's conversation is about emergency preparedness. That's the letter C, which stands for crisis. This series is sponsored by the National Cooperative Procurement Partners, the professional association for public procurement. NCPP has taken a leadership role by guiding the discussion and the education on cooperative procurement best practices, as well as collaboration efforts to bring stakeholders together to solve real procurement issues. All the strategic suppliers and cooperative partners listed here have contributed to make this free webinar series possible for public procurement professionals. I'm Tammy Rhymes. I'm the former purchasing agent for the City of San Diego, and my passion is providing meaningful educational opportunities where real people share their real stories to help others. So I'm going to briefly start with my own experience at the City of San Diego. In 2007, the Witch Creek fires hit Southern California. The fire, it started in northern San Diego County, specifically the town of Ramona, and that's where I live. For 17 days, the fires raged across the county with hot Santa Ana winds pushing it faster than fire crews could contain it. And it was one of the largest evacuations in San Diego's recent history. Here's the stats on this emergency. The cost, $18 million. The burned area was 200,000 acres and over 2,000 homes and structures. 40 firefighters were injured and 2 civilians died. In my own personal circumstance, because I lived in Ramona where the fire started, I was cut off from getting to the Emergency Operations Center. For over 4 days, I couldn't leave my area due not only to the fire, but because the National Guard was called in and shut down all road access. So as a result, many of my team members and I conducted emergency business, calling each other at home, and even some were sitting in the evacuation center with their own families and still working on city business. It was a really scary time for all of us. And I'm proud to say my procurement team rocked. They rose to the challenge and met every incoming request and demand, because that's what purchasing does. We serve those departments who serve the public, and emergencies put us to the test in the very best way. So I'm under my own personal emergency right now. If any of you are familiar with me and my speaking, you might notice that I sound a little froggy today, and I am overcoming a bit of laryngitis. So in any given emergency, you call in reinforcements. So I have called my good friend and colleague, Jeff Airholtz from the National Joint Powers Alliance to help me with this webinar today, and he's going to take over the next portion to also talk to some other panelists and leaders out there in procurement who have handled emergencies. So thank you, Jeff, for your help today.
Thank you, Tammy. Feel better. Today we're proud to interview some prominent procurement leaders who rock at what they do, specifically handling emergency situations for their own agencies. They are here today to share their knowledge and expertise with all of us as we introduce the second topic of the webinar series, Calming the Rough Seas, Crisis Management. Let's start in the West, way out west to the islands of Hawaii. We have invited Sarah Allen, the Chief Procurement Officer for the state of Hawaii. In addition to her current title and responsibilities, Sarah has a rich procurement background, formerly serving as Senior Acquisition Analyst for CACI in the Pentagon, as a contracting officer in the U.S. Air Force, and on the board for the National Contract Management Association. And she received the Distinguished Graduate Award in the first year of the NCMA Leadership Program. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. Sarah, for many emergencies across the country, public agencies can often call on surrounding counties, cities, or other jurisdictions to help out or send additional resources when needed. However, in your case, with your team literally located on an island with miles of ocean around you, how do you manage your available resources during an emergency?
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me on your webinar today. From a procurement point of view, the state is working on a robust system that leverages current contracts, emergency vendor lists, and cooperatives, such as GSA, NASPO, and others who will work with us. The vendor list is continuously open, and we encourage firms to add their names by visiting our website at spo.hawaii.gov. In addition, Jennifer Walter, our Hawaii Emergency Management Agency Preparedness Branch Chief, tells us, like every state, we will first use the resources available within the state, which can involve unique logistical challenges. Depending on how many islands are affected, we would anticipate some mutual aid from one county to another, as you see on the mainland, that though there are no formalized mutual aid agreements between the local governments. Support from our National Guard has been used in past events to meet urgent needs, in addition to commercial air and sea transportation resources. We also participate in the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which is the vehicle through which states provide mutual aid to one another when a state's governor has declared a disaster. Other entities such as the power companies also have mutual aid agreements in place that would provide reinforcements from the mainland. It is worth noting that the disasters that are potentially most devastating, hurricane and tsunami, would affect a significant portion of the workforce we are counting on to respond to the event, as most of the housing is in coastal areas that would be inundated. The resources available within the state are very limited, particularly on the neighbor islands. We have a just-in-time logistics system with almost all of our essential commodities flowing through the port of Honolulu and then transshipped to neighbor islands. Prior to hurricane threat, it is not unusual to find stores completely sold out of bottled water. One major big box store reported that the closure of a port for 2 days during a recent storm threat set them behind almost a week. A disaster that prompts the closure of this port for any period of time will result in critical shortages of essential supplies needed to sustain our population, in some cases within just a few days. Critically, 100% of our fuel is imported. Our ability to operate generators, restore power, fuel equipment and response vehicles, to refuel planes bringing in relief supplies, etc., hinges on an operational port of Honolulu. These shortages will affect entire state, given Honolulu's role as the central hub, and will make procurement within the state extremely difficult. A major disaster, even if the port was not affected, will require extensive help from the mainland and the federal government, which will be coordinated with FEMA. The surge demand for key supplies needed for life-saving, life-sustaining, and recovery activities will require a major logistics operation to move resources from the mainland. In addition, many large resources needed following a major disaster, such as heavy equipment, power poles, large generators, and construction supplies for rebuilding, would have to be brought in because of their limited availability within the state. There is a large military presence in the state, and we would anticipate in a major event that DoD support, coordinated through FEMA, would be a major component of such a logistics operation. All this would involve considerable costs.
Sarah, being in Hawaii, are there special circumstances or responsibilities that your team might have to handle that most of us might not think about?
Well, the vulnerability of the port, as I described before, is certainly a major issue. Even if our regular transportation network is functioning, the time it takes to move commodities and responders to the island from the mainland is a challenge. The cost of air transport is substantial and would not provide sufficient capacity to meet anticipated needs. In a disaster, requested resources are often needed yesterday. Transit time by ocean from the West Coast requires 5 to 8 days by commercial cargo vessel and about 5 hours by commercial flight. When the scope of an event is limited to one of the neighbor islands, the logistical challenges can still be considerable. Most of the major resources in the state are on Oahu, so neighbor islands will be relying on the state to help procure and transport resources they have run out of. Commonly needed disaster response items that can be easily and cheaply procured on the mainland are costly and difficult to deliver in Hawaii. For example, during tropical storm Isel, which impacted the Big Island, that state was asked to procure ice, which had to be flown in by the Air National Guard. Another major consideration is how will we support our substantial visitor population, which constitutes 15% of the state's total population on any given day, and sometimes can be even greater on some of the islands. We have to think about sustaining not only our resident population, but also our visitors, who will probably be much less prepared. While we try to educate our residents to store at least 10 days of supplies, visitors will likely have limited resources on hand. Given we live on islands, people can't evacuate where there is a threat, such as a hurricane, like they can on the mainland, to move out of harm's way. A substantial number of homes are older and single-wall construction that will likely not stand up to damaging winds. The potential for widespread destruction of people's homes poses huge challenges for recovery, not only in terms of the need for temporary housing, but the influx of construction material and workers needed to rebuild. During blue sky days, there is a housing shortage. Unlike the mainland, where FEMA trailers can be brought in, we will not see that in Hawaii.
Thank you. When the media and politicians are involved, Sarah, does that complicate or help the situation?
Well, it can be both. The media is a critical partner for us. We are very lucky in Hawaii to have very positive relationships with the local media. They help us tell people how to be prepared and stay safe prior to and during an event, and help us publicize how people can get help after an event. At the same time, the chaos of a disaster can cause a lot of misinformation to spread quickly, and there is a high demand from the media for new information and access to leaders. In some cases, usually when the national media becomes involved, the time required to correct these misunderstandings and respond to inquiries can tax limited resources. We would also anticipate a major disaster would attract a substantial amount of foreign media given the demographics of our visitor population. The advent of social media presents new challenges and opportunities. While it offers a quick way to get out messages to a wide audience, it can be a vehicle for misinformation to spread quickly. In addition, other places that have experienced more recent disasters have found that people were using social media to request assistance, which response agencies were not expecting and did not have protocols for monitoring, prioritizing, or answering. With limited PIO staff and our lack of first-hand experience with the effects of social media during a major disaster, it is an area for us where additional planning resources should be focused. Emergency management agencies operate under the overall direction and control of the governor or county mayor, who are invested with emergency authorities under state law. The involvement of the chief elected official of the jurisdiction is essential when emergency powers are needed to release emergency funds and or temporarily suspend regulations that will enable aid to be developed more rapidly. It is important that emergency management officials are communicating with elected officials regularly during an event so they understand the needs and what actions they can take to most effectively help address the impacts. We have found that it is critical to communicate with and educate elected officials prior to a disaster so they understand the key players and processes. A major disaster can be a confusing intersection of local, state, federal, and non-profit agencies. If elected officials are not familiar with the key players, their roles and authorities, there can be a disconnect between what certain agencies are legally allowed to do and what elected officials are expecting them to do. In Hawaii, the State Emergency Management Agency has an Emergency Management 101 class that is given to elected officials.
Thank you. Sarah, you touched on it, but since Hawaii is one of the top tourist destinations in the world, you have millions of visitors each year. How do you coordinate your emergency operations with those folks who might not be familiar with the islands, its resources, nor have a residential address or contact information?
Sure. The state emergency management agencies work closely with the Hawaii Tourism Authority, which is a state agency that we will use as a central conduit for information to flow through between the visitor industry and our EOC. The county emergency management agencies have a seat in their EOC for their county visitor bureaus. We also coordinate closely with visitor industry associations that are key partners in helping us keep tourists safe and informed. For example, the Hawaii Hotel Visitor Industry Security Association, or HHVISA, has a representative on the coordination calls we have with the National Weather Service when a storm is threatening Hawaii. Many of the hotels have protocols they follow to inform their guests when a hurricane or tsunami watch is in effect, and a large number of major hotels plan to allow their guests to shelter in place during a hurricane or advise guests to vertically evacuate to their higher floors during a tsunami. We have also engaged the hotels, airlines, ground transportation association, county visitor bureaus, foreign consulates, and the Department of State in a work group to discuss the evacuation of visitors from the island following a major disaster. Those plans are under development. There is also an effort to ensure emergency information is available in multiple languages.
Thank you, Sarah. Before we move on, if anyone has specific questions for Sarah or any generic questions for any panelist, please use the chat box on your screen to submit those. And now, we will be heading over to the Midwest, specifically toward Kansas. Darren Muci is responsible for oversight and management of a wide range of departments, including purchasing, supply, production printing, student transportation, nutrition services, and building venue sponsorships. His span of control includes management of over 300 employees and a budget of over $55 million. Darren, since you are located in the Midwest, we often assume that tornadoes and storms are your typical emergency situation. However, your introduction to handling emergencies started with a big bang, more specifically, a grain plant explosion. Can you tell us about that experience and how you handled that emergency?
Indeed I can, and thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, this definitely was my indoctrination to emergencies, and as I think back to that day, which was in June of 1998, I can say carefully that we were just not prepared for an emergency of that magnitude. We, with the exception of a policy that allowed us to make purchases in an emergency situation, we had no procedures for facilitating purchases in an organized manner. As you said, typical emergency or crisis situations in the Midwest revolve around storms, and this was something that was definitely not the norm. This was the DeBruce grain elevator, which at the time was the largest grain elevator in the world with a capacity of over 21 million bushels, and it was 2,700 feet long, over half a mile long, excuse me. There were 7 deaths in the multiple explosions and 10 injuries, and President Clinton declared a federal emergency which allowed for the deployment of FEMA staff, including the Urban Search and Rescue Team. This entire situation took probably 4 days in what I would call critical exercises, and then lasted the better part of a week, if not plus, for the cleanup. I remember being summoned to our emergency operations center by my then boss, who is an assistant county manager, and I'd actually only been in our EOC one other time. And I remember at the time how it was organized, and there was actually a platform area near the rear of the room for elected officials, as though those are the individuals that would be making the decisions. Well, when I was summoned to the EOC by the assistant county manager, the elected county officials were on their way out because it was going to take someone that could get into the weeds. And my supervisor said, Darren, listen, take good notes, and buy everything that we need. And then he walked out as well. I began documenting everything that we did, that I did, so that I would have records, not knowing that that was going to be a very, very important part of our ability to work with FEMA in the aftermath of this episode. One of our greatest challenges was that we had a room full of chiefs, if you will, and not enough folks that wanted to be in the weeds. And the emergency manager then emergency manager struggled to really take control of the processes because we had heads of law enforcement agencies, emergency responders, obviously myself from purchasing, state agencies that arrived, and we all seemed to be doing our own thing. So initially it was a bit of a cluster. The good part of that was as word got out through the media, obviously, we had quite a few people and companies that really jumped into volunteerism mode, and people showed up. They donated food and water, clothing for workers, arrived to pretty much stand vigil and provide support. However, as you can imagine, there was a lot of pain in that regard because we had some vendors that took it upon themselves to show up with equipment or showed up at the gate and said, we're here to help or do this, and then later billed us for their time when they hadn't been requested in an official capacity to be there. It was most definitely a learning experience for many of us, and I certainly took that opportunity after the hot wash debrief of our entire process, specifically developed policy to govern purchases in emergency situations, and that included development of a purchases log, and that was very important because we were going to need that information to submit to FEMA for any reimbursement consideration. Developed a vendor contractor catalog of typical products and services, and began the process of developing contracts for typical service providers. It also provided an opportunity, as I debriefed with the purchasing department staff, for us to think about what other types of emergencies we had had to deal with in the past. And that allowed for us to develop our first emergency purchases manual that included sections on typical emergencies, what were the challenges, and then what were the types of products and or services we might need. That became our written encyclopedia, if you will. Again, this is back to 1998. We were still keeping a lot of things on paper, but we had that for us whenever we needed a resource to help us make decisions moving forward.
Thank you, Darren. Darren, as a trainer for many NIGP conferences on this topic, can you provide some advice for those who may be in the audience listening who have never had to yet handle an emergency situation? What are first steps that you might recommend to help them start getting ready?
Absolutely, I can. And there are so many important steps, and I couldn't list these in a 1 through 10. They're all important, but a very brief list would be, first and foremost, to understand the elements of emergency management. Point 1 is mitigation and prevention. Point 2 is preparedness. Point 3 is response. And point 4 is recovery. Then understanding that there are sub-steps within each one of those main areas. Second, from experience, and I highly recommend it, is to develop a purchasing mantra for jumping into these extraordinary situations. All purchasing departments typically will have a mission statement that's to cover everything that you do, but in a crisis situation, I developed a mantra for us that's an acronym. It's SCOPE. S for support, C for collaboration, O for organization, P for professionalism, and E for efficiency. Everything that we wanted to do, everything that we would need to do should fall within one of those letter delineators. Next, purchasing must have agency and policy authority to take action. And of course, being ready to respond and serve, having the current emergency purchasing manual updated and available, being prepared to communicate with vendors in a much different fashion, and of course taking no action without the approval of the emergency manager, who's got to be in control of the Emergency Operations Center. Making and tracking the appropriate purchases, being prepared to reconcile those. Some of those take time. And 3 other things that are very, very important. Being mindful of what else is happening in your organization. Work always continues. Life goes on. Someone has to be in the office to be able to take care of the regular things that are needed in the day and the life of the organization. Debriefing with your staff and stakeholders at the conclusion of the event and making sure that you're taking care of your staff. Our work in purchasing is always very stressful, but in a crisis situation, it's even doubly so. Making sure that your staff is doing okay, understanding whether or not they may have connections to a crisis event and how you're going to be able to support them, spell them if they need a break, or call in some experts that can help them make decisions or think through the processes. Next would be, as you work through that, develop a crisis plan, which obviously we all know is a basic guide for planning for a response to any extraordinary event or situation. And the last thing that I found very helpful is to have a purchasing go bag. Sarah mentioned this, I think, at the very beginning, which is that you may be in a situation where you're going to have to provide purchasing services from an auxiliary site. And that purchasing go bag would be filled with everything you might need to do to set up an auxiliary purchasing department that may be a desk and a rock to sit on in the middle of nowhere. Those are 5 important areas that a newbie to an emergency situation or in the purchasing department can use to help get things going.
Darren, we do have a question from the audience, a non-scripted one, but they ask, is the school district able to incorporate emergency language into its term contracts for goods or services that FEMA will accept when and if they're implemented in a crisis situation?
That's a very good question. First and foremost, and we all know that each school district is different. Here in Kansas, we have a set of statutes that govern all unified or public school districts. It's very important to work closely with your legal counsel for your school district or any organization to help bridge that gap to understand who might be providing direction in situations that are of an extraordinary nature. In our situation, we typically have a standard service contract for many cases that has standard language that actually is required by statute in Kansas that protects us and makes very clear what the expectations are. And in situations where lately we've had to involve FEMA, we've shared with them those contracts so they could see what we're operating under, because ultimately we are responsible first as the first responder and supporter of an emergency situation.
Thank you, Darren. And for those asking questions, we have quite a few about the scope. We will, on the NCPP website, have answers to all the questions, so you'll be able to see them. We've been asked to redefine the acronym, and we will do that in writing at the end or conclusion of it. Darren, when Tammy had to handle the fires in San Diego, her personal experience was that it was helpful to have already established relationships with suppliers and cooperatives for some of the top needed emergency services. In cases where you have handled emergencies, has that been your experience?
Absolutely, yes. And this is a time-consuming process. As I mentioned, thinking back to the grain elevator explosion, we had quite a few vendors, long-term vendors and suppliers in our community that would be willing to show up. And those are the ones that you love, but you want to make certain that you've got them in your pocket, if you will, and I mean that in a positive and professional sense, meaning that you've dotted I's and crossed T's so that they're going to be able to provide the services that you need. In terms of working at Sedgwick County during that time frame, we worked through the process of contacting many of the vendors that had responded to some of our emergency crisis situations. Worked with our legal team to develop a standard agreement, identified some basic services or products that we might need, and identified what general pricing structures we might need in an emergency situation, factoring in that not every situation is going to take place between 8 and 5 a.m., not during lunch. So there may be times that vendors or suppliers may need to have a different pricing structure for after hours, whether that's second or third shift. And it's important to know that they've got people that need to be paid and remunerated for their work. So working through those processes with your vendors, very conversational at first, recognizing that each vendor or supplier would have a different pricing structure and or may not be available. So yes, it would fall into the category of definitely something that you would need to do conversational in initiating that, and then the information, final contracts would be in your emergency purchasing manual as a resource for obviously a crisis situation or a best practice. And typically you would want to have those contracts that might last for a year, and you would review these on a regular basis.
Thank you, Darren. We had one question that asked if you would define the contents of the go bag again, please.
I most definitely can do that. First and foremost, think about what you might need if you needed to grab your everything and go to an alternative situation. And let me go to a quick list here where I can look at that. And I'm not finding it, excuse me, here we go. So obviously your procedures manual, emergency contact information, a staff responsibility list, desk supplies, paper, pens, obviously a laptop, a printer, your procedures manual, your procurement card, and sub-point of that in an emergency situation, make sure that you can contact someone in your finance department to up the purchasing or credit limit of your P card if you're going to have to be spending like crazy. That emergency vendor list, a list of other available resources, typical office supplies, obviously cell phone, flash drives, anything that you might need if you're going to have to work at a remote site. Thinking also that you may not have access to your financial system or ERP, and you may need a manual purchase order template as well for those vendors that might need something very official looking.
Darren, thank you. All of our presenters, guest presenters, volunteered their time to present. Darren needs to leave for his real paying job with the Wichita Public Schools early, so I wanted to get the specific questions into Darren now. Thank you. Our third panelist just handled one of the nation's most recent storms, Hurricane Matthew, that started in the Caribbean and proceeded to the southeast coast. Kimberly Massie, CPPB, is the Director of Procurement for Horry County, South Carolina. Including her time with Horry County, Kim has over 31 years experience in local government, with 25 of those years spent in a purchasing role. Welcome, Kim. Being located on Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, right on the coastline, you've had to deal with your share of hurricanes and weather-related storms, including Hurricane Joaquin in 2015 and the most recent Hurricane Matthew. Understanding that your county is within Hurricane Alley, how do you prepare for impending storm systems?
Thank you, Duff. I'm glad to be here today. Every county is fortunate to have an emergency management department staffed with experts that continuously coordinate and plan training with the procurement department. Our emergency management department has an extensive emergency plan, including logistics, that is updated on a regular basis. As part of our after-action report requirements, we update our plans and training opportunities based on lessons learned. FEMA-sponsored online training has been very beneficial for us. Also, training exercises are an important element to an overall emergency plan. It's important to be sure that, as a procurement professional, you understand your role and the expectations of others during an emergency situation. As mentioned earlier, I would have to agree that pre-positioning contracts is critical for goods and services as a most advantageous activity. However, you will need to procure these contracts using the latest FEMA regulations. Another important consideration is to communicate with your team regarding who's going to work when and what their responsibilities will be during that shift.
Thank you, Kim. During the emergency and with a very limited staff, how do you balance the needs of all of your customers?
Well, to build on what the earlier panelist has said, they hit the nail on the head when, as you can imagine, some emergency situations could cause the government offices to be closed, so we can focus solely on the emergency situation at hand. In addition, our customer base increases significantly when the Emergency Operations Center is activated. As far as balancing our customer needs, my awesome staff tries to prioritize every request as we receive it. It does present challenges dealing with the non-emergency affected customers who may become frustrated that their demands have to wait. My team just tries to patiently explain the situation and hope they will understand. As Sarah described earlier on, having executive support for my team efforts is critical.
Thanks. Kim, when a state of emergency is declared, that paves the way for FEMA reimbursement. Since you've had to go down that path at least a couple of times, what are some suggestions to help other procurement teams be focused on what to track and how to make that process go a bit more smoothly?
As Darren mentioned just a moment ago, understanding FEMA's requirements and especially their required forms is helpful. That way you're capturing the necessary information critical for reimbursement as the events unfold. It may be difficult to go back in time and try to capture that certain information. Also, if you train your customer departments to understand the extra requirements for FEMA reimbursement, things such as the SAM verification, MBE efforts, debris management, work categories, things of that nature. This may help you from being bogged down while you're trying to deal with the incoming resource requests. Another suggestion I might have that was mentioned earlier is having things pre-prepared. As an example, we have a lengthy determination and finding document that elevates the procurement thresholds during an emergency. I have that already prepared so that I can drop in a few pieces of key information and then seek executive approval. Another helpful item during an emergency has been what every county refers to as an e-card program, which is an emergency purchasing card program. These cards are separate from the normal operational purchasing cards, and they're only activated as required during an emergency. We've prearranged everything with the card issuer or the bank regarding the overall monthly credit so that all we have to do is notify the bank that we are going to activate certain cards so that we don't have to worry about our credit limit. And these e-cards have worked extremely well for tracking emergency purchases separate from normal operational needs.
Thank you, Kim. Are there any surprises or lessons learned that you can share with our audience on handling an emergency situation?
Sure. I'd like to give one specific example, and it goes back to what was being talked about earlier about establishing relationships. Portalets. Portable toilets aren't necessarily something a procurement person has on their mind when they're sitting in a generator-supported EOC, the lights are on, everything seems to be functioning normally in the EOC, but we had to set up some traffic control points, both in 2015 and again this year when we had our emergency, and we needed to put portalets at those traffic control points. The established relationship we had with the contract vendor made him Johnny on the spot, pardon the pun, because we had already established the relationship. We had a contractual relationship. We worked with him. He was awesome. Unfortunately, I also witnessed what a state agency had to go through to obtain and keep service a portable toilet unit for a non-Horry County supported traffic control point, and it was a very sad situation.
Kim, we have a question from the audience that you may or may not be able to answer, so this is non-scripted. How do counties or public agencies manage the FEMA requirement to ensure that procurements are solicited to small and minority businesses? Is that a factor during an emergency?
It should be, but in all reality, that is something that easily slips the mind. Knowing your MBE or DBE vendors up front is very advantageous. If you look ahead to pre-positioned contracts, that's where I would recommend that you do that type of activity so that you've already had that in place and it is not as big of a consideration during the actual emergency.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, and finally, we are doing something a bit different during this webinar. We have invited someone who isn't a procurement manager to present. Instead, he is a customer department, specifically a fleet department manager. Please welcome Kelly Reagan from the City of Columbus, Ohio. Kelly, thanks for joining us to provide a customer department's point of view for our procurement audience. Kelly, during this past year's GFX Fleet Conference, your City of Columbus team was chosen as the #1 fleet among leading government fleets, and you were chosen as the top fleet manager of the year. We congratulate you on both awards. We have a few supervisors listening in today. As a long-term government employee and manager, what do you do within the civil service world to create a team that excels and inspires?
Duff, Tammy, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this group. What an honor it is. And I've heard some great suggestions and great policy-driven actions from the folks here from the procurement side. And I think what we do that fits so well with Columbus and has made us what we are today is that we've gone from becoming an agency or a division that's driven by other agencies to a division that actually drives the ship. In other words, we have gone from being a division that was told what we were going to do to a division that has taken control and become a policy-driven agency. Several years ago, I spoke at a governing conference in the city of San Francisco and spoke with regard to the benefits of having the division of fleet underneath finance. Just so happens that our division resides under finance and has for about the last 10 years. It just so happens that purchasing resides under finance as well. So we're brothers, so to speak, underneath the same umbrella, the same department, which is finance. And so being under finance has given us tremendous autonomy to do things that other fleets, I think, struggle to do often, that reside or are nested within public works or others. Not to say that good things aren't being done in those cities, because I'm certain they are. I know many of those fleet managers, but I think it's a different path and can be a bit more of a challenge. So some of the things that we've done to answer your question with what makes us different is we are clearly a policy-driven agency. In other words, we've been empowered under the Director of Finance and the Mayor's office to drive the fleet soup to nuts. Anything and everything that comes into fleet must move and be bottlenecked through fleet. So we've done away with things like police going out to Dermo and getting whatever unit they wanted because it was free, quote, end quote, and or grant vehicles coming into fleet that we knew nothing about. So that now all incoming fleet is bottlenecked right down to the legislative process. I sign off on all legislation going before council, whether it's grant or regardless how we're bringing a vehicle in. And we have all authority for everything coming into fleet and everything going out of fleet. So all acquisition, all disposition, all title administration, and we answer directly to the Director of Finance, who answers to the Mayor's office. But being a policy-driven agency and having policy such an executive order from the Mayor's office has given us the authority that we need to have all authority over fleet soup to nuts. So that's the first step that's changed in the City of Columbus in the last 10 years, other than being under the Department of Finance. and purchasing being our brother, so to speak. So what it's enabled us to do is to do things a little more quickly than other agencies. I know one of the questions was, how does purchasing make us a priority? Well, you know what? We're kind of the priority because we're their brother, and both agencies are in the director of finance's ear, and we're kissing cousins. We can't be fighting. We have to be getting along. And so we do get along. And to get along means to be flexible and be giving one way or another. So we get along, and really purchasing helps to make us a priority. So let me just wrap up this one point to say that we are a policy-driven agency. I'm a finance guy by nature. I've never wrenched a day in my life, but I really paint real well, just ask my wife. And we are a policy-driven agency, and our people on the floor, there are 130 employees in our operation with a $40 million budget and a $50 million capital replacement budget, which includes general fund purchases. And we are, all of our employees, right down to the techs on the floor, have vision. So vision is very important in our department, and transparency. We're transparent, and when we move to pursue a leading fleet position, number one, leading fleet position, or we move to become an ASE Blue Seal facility, or whatever it is we're moving forward within in the industry, our entire department knows what's going on and knows why we're seeking that. What's the benefit? What's in it for you to do that? And so what's happened is, 10 years ago, we went from a division that everybody was telling us what we were going to do and when we were going to do it, to now we tell divisions what they'll do and how they're going to do it. But of course, that is done through consensus, and it's done through building consensus, through conversation, through FaceTime, and through the help of our purchasing department. Purchasing and fleet work extremely well together within the city of Columbus, and that's because we're very transparent with one another.
Thank you, Kelly. Being located in the northern part of the country, you deal with your share of winter storms and snow. In preparation for that season, what are steps that you and your staff start to coordinate with your own customer departments?
Well, that's a great question. Here it is, real simple. In the winter, we plan for summer. In the summer, we plan for winter. In the summer, we're working on plow trucks and getting them ready for the winter. And then in the winter, we're still working on plow trucks because they're being torn up and handling all of the snow that we get. And we're working on mowers for the mowing season. So it's a reverse osmosis here. We're always working on the next season's equipment to ensure that our departments and our end users have what they need, and they're able to meet their missions within their respective divisions with the equipment that they are provided. And it's incumbent upon the Division of Fleet to see that they have everything that they need when they need it to complete their missions. If they don't, then it comes back on us.
Great answer. Kelly, I have a non-scripted question, and it is, what are the benefits for fleet to report to finance rather than facility?
That's an excellent question, and I do know that some fleets report to facilities. I know I had the folks in from Yale University, the director of fleet and facilities, and Yale happens to have both of their operations under the director of facilities and fleet. And I don't know that I've met that many that reside both in facilities and fleet, and that is one agency or department. I think, frankly, that makes a lot of sense, rolling up facilities and fleet. What makes less sense, I think, is having them embedded in public works, just because if they're embedded in public works, it can keep the primary focus on things like tandem axle plows, single axle plows, street sweepers, vector flushers, those sorts of things, and not so much on the first responder side. So for our fleet to be residing in finance, our focus is global from a standpoint of we're handling everything from batwing mowers between our 25 golf sites throughout the city to ladder trucks, 105-foot ladder trucks, and vector flushers for Department of Public Utilities, and everything in between, excavators, backhoes, and everything else. So we found tremendous success in reporting to finance. I suspect, based on the few that I know that are embedded in facilities, where facilities and fleet management are together, it seems to me from what they've told me, it works incredibly well. And I think that makes great sense as well.
Thank you. Kelly, there are several hundred purchasing folks who are listening in right now. For many of them, fleet is often one of their largest customers. As a key customer department for your own purchasing division, what are ways that you've taken to coordinate better with your assigned buyers?
Excellent question. I think one of the things that we've done when it comes to everything, the way from what we're buying, we all know we're buying from many, many different funds. We could be buying from grant funds, we could be buying from CMAQ funds, DOE funds, we could be buying from JAG funds if it's police, all sorts of different funds that often have all sorts of different requirements to them. And one of the first things we've learned to enjoy success in working with our purchasing department is anything and everything that we do on the acquisition side, whether it be parts and or goods or services, we always bring purchasing to the table first of all. And we remain transparent with purchasing. And in doing so, what we find is that we can have an honest conversation with our purchasing department and say, look, this is what we're trying to accomplish. This is what we would like to do, whether it's standardization, whether it's dealing with a different grant with a different requirement, and this is what we'd like to do, and we'd like your help in doing it. Now, we're not the purchasing experts. You guys are the purchasing experts, and you guys understand 329.1 or our purchasing code. So what we look for you to do is to give us direction and guide us through this minefield of not doing things well or not doing things right and dealing with upset bidders. So we look for you to help us do that, and we remain perfectly transparent with our purchasing department. Now, that doesn't always come with, we're going to do what you want, Kelly, because there are times when they say, look, we don't know that we can accomplish what you'd like to accomplish, but now that we know what your objective is and what you want to accomplish, we understand what you're thinking and why you're thinking it. We can help you work to that end. Now, the outcome might be a little different than what you want, but there'll be reasons for it, and you'll understand why. So if I can encourage anything from a fleet perspective, it's on the front end, bring in your purchasing department. And be a policy-driven agency that brings your purchasing department in at the very front end and help them understand what you're trying to accomplish and what the end game is. Because we found it to work very, very well here in the city of Columbus.
Thank you, Kelly. Now we're going to give you a moment to dream. In a perfect world, if you could have the best of fleet and the best of purchasing together, what would that look like? And how would it be different from what is happening today?
That's an excellent question. If I were sitting here dreaming, and I have thought of this many times, dear sir, my thoughts are that I would have purchasing embedded in fleet and not accountable to fleet, but embedded in fleet and working solely for fleet with a focus, whether it's a purchasing expediter and a purchasing professional, 2 or 3 or 4 people that are just focused on fleet objectives and meeting fleet objectives. And again, still though, with oversight from a professional manager and or / director that has ultimate authority over that purchasing department or those purchasing folks. But to have those folks embedded in the agency, whether it's 2 or 3 or 4 people that are working with fleet, I mean, we're purchasing $4.5 million in parts a year. We're purchasing $40 to $50 million in assets, everything from cruisers to tandem axle dumps, single axle dumps, street sweepers. So all of the specking that goes on and all of the other things, the standardizations that we're dealing with. For example, why do we want, when we bid, why do we put a bid out for Fords, and why is that okay to establish a universal term contract? Because whether you're a Ford fleet or a GM fleet or a Chrysler fleet, most folks know that a fleet looks for standardization, and if you're buying all GMs or you're buying all Fords, you're really looking to maintain standardization. And the purchasing department understands that if you help them see what's going on in your operation. For example, all of my techs are trained on Ford IDS, and they've all been to school for IDS, and all of our links and our computer systems are linked to IDS and Ford training. So from a standardization standpoint, which I think sometimes can be a swear word for a purchasing department, and I understand why, because the idea is competitive bidding, following the city code, doing all of the things that we're supposed to be doing when we're supposed to be doing them. And sometimes guys like me or guys like me out in the user agencies don't really have an appreciation for what purchasing is trying to accomplish, and that's keeping us out of hot water and making sure that we're doing things that we're supposed to be doing when we're supposed to be doing them. And we're not stepping outside of the law or the boundaries. But I'm here to tell you that for being as long as we are transparent with the purchasing department, I believe that 99.9% of the time they want to do what we would like to have them do. So back to your question, I would love to have a purchasing group embedded within the division of fleet that answered not to fleet, but answered to the purchasing department. And some of these agencies that are on this call today may in fact operate that way. That would be my wish and my dream.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for being our first non-procurement panelist. Before I turn it back over to the star, Tammy Rhymes, with the froggy voice, I do have one question for Sarah and Kim, if you are still there, or Kelly, if you have an opinion. How do public utilities prepare for a coordinated emergency response with the rest of their agency? Panelist experts, do you have an opinion on that? The PUDs, the electric, the gas, how are they incorporated into your, go ahead, sir.
This is Kim from Horry County, South Carolina. What we do down here is that, again, our experts in emergency management make sure that all of the utilities, because utilities are actually separate in South Carolina. They're not part of the local government. They're separate authorities. But our emergency management department makes sure that those people are brought to the table when it's time to coordinate training, write up plans, emergency plans, things of that nature, to make sure that we're all on the same page when the disaster strikes.
And this is Sarah from Hawaii. Basically the same thing, except that the utilities are incorporated into regular calls for planning, and we are in the middle of the development of a more robust program in that regard.
Thank you. All questions will be answered. If not today, they will be answered on the NCPP website or directly back to whoever asked them. And a copy of the presentation, this is being recorded, will be available on the NCPP website also. Tammy, back to you for the conclusion.
Thanks, Duff. I appreciate it. And thanks to all our panelists as well. So one final thought for this emergency preparedness webinar, and it's one lesson I learned during my own emergency situations. As soon as that 911 call comes in and those first responders are dispatched, who are you going to call? You're going to call your auditor's office. Yep, you got to think about accounting during an emergency, because the spending, as Darren says, starts right away. And at some point, sometimes weeks later, you're going to have to account for all that spending for your city council, for FEMA, for your vendor payments, and yeah, even sometimes for media requests. And the best way to do that is to set up a job order number right away at the beginning to start tracking all those expenses. I want to thank all our panelists for sharing their stories and insight, and a special thanks to Duff Fairholtz for his help in moderating today. In addition to this webinar series, NCPP has created this brand new roadmap to a cooperative procurement strategy. No matter what kind of agency you work for or where you're located across the country, this resource can be your go-to document to assess and evaluate the use of cooperative contracts. Please feel free to download a copy from the NCPP website, or you can email us to receive a complimentary hard copy as well. Please sign up to attend our next webinar series in February. It's called Walking the Plank, and it will cover the tough stuff: negotiations, protest, and conflict management. Each webinar counts toward 1 hour of continuing education credits. In addition to your certificate, you'll also receive a survey via email. And for those of you who have filled out surveys in the past, we appreciate that. That's how we came up with these webinars. We value your feedback and ideas for future training sessions. This is Tammy Rhymes, and I wish you the best as you go forth and procure. Thank you.